Welcome to Virtual Wednesdays. My name is Devin Malone, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. I'm glad you've joined us for tonight's conversation, AIDS Intervention in the 1980s. In this deeply personal conversation, Bjorn Guil Amelan, Patrick Kelly's former business and life partner, speaks with Ernest Hopkins, senior strategist and advisor at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, about the impact of AIDS on creative communities in the 1980s. This program is organized in collaboration with the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. This conversation will be introduced by Laura L Karmalango, Associate Curator of Costume and Textile Arts at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and Presenting Curator of Patrick Kelly, Runway of Love. Since 2010, she has curated or co-curated costumes and textile exhibitions for the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. She has most recently co-curated the critically acclaimed exhibition, Contemporary Muslim Fashions. Among other publications, she is the author of The Miser's Purse and the volume editor of Patrick Kelly, Runway of Love, the first ever volume on the designer. She holds a Master of Arts in the History of Decorative Arts and Design from the Parsons School of Design in New York City. Thank you to all of our panelists tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, Devin, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It's an honor to introduce tonight's speakers. Bjorn Amilon was the life and business partner of the late fashion designer Patrick Kelly from 1983 until Kelly's death on January 1st, 1990. In 1993, Amilon moved to New York to begin his personal and professional relationship with director and choreographer Bill T. Jones, whom he married in 2014. Amilon has designed award-winning sets for numerous works of the Bill T. Jones Arnie Zane Company. In 2011, he helped Jones found New York Live Arts, an experimental body-based art center home to the Bill T. Jones Arnie Zane Company, where he serves as creative director. Ernest Hopkins is senior strategist and advisor for the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. He has been engaged with legislative policy affecting the lives of people with HIV/AIDS for more than 2 decades. He has led national advocacy coalitions, testified before congressional committees, and advised Congress on legislative initiatives. He is the recipient of the Congressional Black Caucus Leadership Award and leads national policy and legislative affairs at the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. As a reminder, tonight's program will include a Q&A. Please leave your comments and questions for our speakers in the YouTube chat. And with that, welcome, Ernest and Bjorn.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you very much for the opportunity to spend time with Bjorn. Bjorn, hello. I see you're still on mute.
Yes, hello everyone. Hello, Ernest. Lovely to be here. I look forward to our conversation.
It's fantastic to have an opportunity to reflect on the period of time when Patrick was most prolific in the 80s. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you about his journey and your journey together, but then also to reflect on some of the environmental aspects, both in the United States and Europe, during the time when you were together. And so maybe you want to give us a bird's eye view of how you met. That's always a fun way to begin the story.
Yeah, why not? Let's start at the beginning. We first met coincidentally at the opening of the Willie Smith new showroom, Willie Smith being the noted African-American designer based in New York. And I was visiting New York. I think it was my first trip to the city in '82. And late '82, I was invited to the opening of that showroom. And there was Patrick, unbeknownst totally coincidentally, because he was already living in Paris and was visiting New York himself at that time. And we traded phone number as 2 young gay men might at an event. I called Patrick the next day. He was flying back to Paris. That was that. And a couple of months later, I sat at a dinner outdoors on the terrace of a Paris restaurant, and came to sit next to me, Patrick. The dinner was organized, I don't remember by whom, I don't know what the occasion was, it was completely coincidental. He was seated next to me. He talked about his work in a way that convinced me. There was something so passionate about his work that had me curious to accept his invitation to go and see it, which I did. And we slept together for the first time that night.
The good old days in the 80s. That's how we got to know each other.
Yes.
I love the fact that you met at a Willie Ware opening. I used to love Willie Smith's clothes. He was iconic for us at the time, yes. And seemed very contemporary to us, even though he was probably probably 10 years our senior. But he was someone who we looked up to as a real aspiration. One of the things that we talked about, Bjorn, as we were preparing for this, is that in many ways, Patrick's story is an American creative story of migration from the South, with pit stops here and there, with great inspiration from iconic women. And I note that both Patrick and his relative contemporary, Sylvester James, known as Sylvester in San Francisco, they both were deeply inspired by Josephine Baker. Mm-hmm. And they both are Virgos. I was fascinated by that in so many ways, their paths, living and being famous and having their most creative periods in the 80s, both children of the South, even though Sylvester was actually born in Watts, Los Angeles. His family comes from Arkansas, and we're a part of the same kind of great migration story that I think is emblematic of Patrick moving from Vicksburg, Mississippi to Atlanta to New York, finally finding his greatest success in Europe, in Paris. Both also having a somewhat fraught relationship with their families, always complicated in Black families, deep love, but also deep connections to religiosity and the Black church. And of course, at the time, there was so much unknown, which then bred a lot of fear and stigma, both about homosexuality and about HIV. And I think in both instances, these disconnects from family became propelling motion to move forward and have their own lives and to succeed.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I would just stress that I think that for Patrick, well, first the AIDS, of course, came later.
Much later.
But being gay, I think, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, at that time, being Black and gay in Vicksburg, Mississippi, were, without even the family context, probably a reason enough to want to leave. Certainly wanting to make a career in fashion was not a helping factor for wanting to stay. And I am reluctant to speak to Patrick's relation and difficulties with his family, in as much as he spoke very little about it. I know it was a very painful period in his life. I know that there was big issues about gayness with his family, but he never really spoke about that much. As something about Patrick always comes to the fore in my mind was how little, within 5 minutes with Patrick, you fell in love with him. I mean, not necessarily in the carnal sense, though that might have happened too, but just he was such an engaging personality. Within a long time with Patrick, after a long time with Patrick, he realized that you knew practically nothing actually about his past. He was very, very guarded that way, while being the most open and accessible person that you might meet. And that contradiction is very emblematic of him as a whole.
Yes, the self-creation, the ability to start new, kind of clean slate in a new place, and solely based on his own creative energies and his ability to engage others, create magic, really, in his clothes and in the whole joy that he created around his creations.
And the fact that he had this attitude whenever something was depressing, he said, snap out of it. He did not want, I think that there was so much pain in him actually, that he chose to block it towards himself. And he had a faculty of blocking things. It's interesting, for example, that Patrick never wanted to talk about his age. He said, if I know my age, I shall feel comfortable with people who are of a very different age. If I don't know my age and I don't think about it, then I'll be equally comfortable with a 10 or a 70-year-old person. And he literally blocked his age out of his mind, in the sense that I, who had a passport and helped him with things, if we were asked for some form-filling question, what year he was born, he turned to me and asked me. So he had literally this faculty of snapping out, blocking certain things that I think would have been overwhelming if he opened those dams. And maybe that firm decision to have his creativity reflect joy, happiness, was so essential of the essence of his creativity, because he had focused so much of his personality to be there rather where natural circumstances might have taken him otherwise.
Right. I mean, and he also chose a creative path that is all about joy and all about fantasy and pleasure. And so, whereas some creatives from similar circumstances went deep and focused on how the challenges of being Black in a racist Southern environment impacted their lives in negative ways, he blocked that completely out and focused in a direction that allowed him to be more magnanimous and see maybe a more beautiful aspect of life. I don't know. What do you think?
Yes and no, because on the I don't, where I say no is he did not block certain wounds, but he transformed them into something. Because, for example, the logo of the fashion house became a gollywog. A gollywog was an English blackface caricature that started out, I believe, as advertised little statuettes, little this size sculptures that were a publicity for jam. They were given as a gift with some preserves or something like that. And they had the name Gollywog, which stuck. At least that's how I understand it. But in any case, this blackface, which Patrick made, a kind of smiling blackface drawing, became the logo of the house of Patrick Kelly. He printed it on fabric. At the time, I was so ignorant about these issues that I could not understand why American department stores would not buy dresses that had a blackface printed on it. Our backers, the big corporation that eventually backed us, Warnaco, they refused for us to distribute the logo, which we printed on shopping bags and on labels for the American market. But Patrick's attitude was to take this symbol of oppression and to recontextualize it as his own. And I think there was a great intelligence at work there, because I think that these very painful images cannot be erased from history. And as long as we try to erase them from history or keep them hidden, they keep a power over us. But with Patrick's attitude of reappropriating the image, making it itself and throwing it back at the face of the perpetrator, I think one changes their power dynamic completely and becomes empowered.
Yes.
And that, I think, was an example of him taking a very negative thing and deliberately turning it into something that in his eyes could have a potential of positivity.
I agree. And it's difficult today. This is still territory that is deeply treacherous. And so with kind of a wry sensibility and acknowledgement and a repurposing, as you suggest, of these what we call now Black memorabilia images, but at the time were, caricatures of Black people that were rooted in a racist and discriminatory past. And so his ability to take those images and try to flip it into something positive and joyful is also, I think it feels very emblematic of his creations, which were all about fantasy and fun and making people feel comfortable and joyous when they put his clothes on.
Yes, and feel good with their body. So he was known, for example, for body hugging shapes, lycra or stretch or whatever. His attitude was to say, whatever your body, show it. I mean, if you are a big person and you put something that's very loose, you're still big. I mean, it's so be happy with yourself, be happy with your body, which I think made him very popular among women who felt that acceptance, and which he demonstrated also in our fashion shows, where we had models of different ages and different body shapes.
What was his connection, if you know, to the coverall, his famous kind of iconic dress for himself?
Well, I think that fundamentally, and Patrick always said that he loved very much Yves Saint Laurent, he loved Madame Grey, but he was as much inspired by that there was as much fashion in one row of pews at his church back in Mississippi as there would be in a whole fashion show in Paris. Things of Black culture were extremely important to Patrick in a way which I didn't even suspect at the time when I was living with him, because as I said, he wasn't one to explain things, but rather to do things. And so the overall, this Oshkosh, oversized overall, which as we know was basically Black workers would work.
Utilitarian work.
Exactly.
Wear, yes.
Specifically, I think a lot of Black workers wore that, as well as wearing high-top, bright-colored shoes, which at the time, we're talking the early, middle 80s, was just beginning to, streetwear fashion was just in infancy, let's say. So Patrick was a precursor on that, but he was really taking on signifiers of his background, of his culture, and in a way totally unexplained and probably completely not understood by his non-US market, not understood even by me at the time, he was actually putting those forward.
Right. I think there's so the word that comes to mind is subversive. So if you know, is the way that it's talked about very much today. But the logo, the overalls, these are cues that he used to connect, to stay connected and to signal connection that actually performed on in a layered way. If you knew all of the backstory, then you had one understanding of it. If you didn't, then maybe you had a completely different understanding. And I would think from corporate America's perspective, the logos felt dangerous because they understood how they could be read by people completely uninformed as something deeply problematic.
I remember, for instance, Patrick always had in his pockets, we made them by the 100, little black baby dolls, plastic black babies with articulated arms and legs, which we had students come to the showroom and glue with pins on with glue guns. So they became brooches.
Yes.
Patrick had always 20, 30 of these in his overall pockets, which he handed anyone whom he interacted with, and sometimes people he didn't even interact with. But I remember this event on Park Avenue. There was a very, very chic store called Martha's, which the Upper East Side ladies with their coif and their faces would come and have personal shoppers dress them and buy clothes from. They did a show of Patrick Kelly, what we call the mock couture, which was a kind of joke on couture, but one-off dress. And we had a trunk show there, and those dresses were being dressed by Patrick. They were in their petticoats with Patrick dressing them, and they were loving it. And they were walking out all with a little black baby doll pinned at their lapels or wherever. And Gloria Steinem was there, and she was a friend. And at the end of the event, she was saying, "You have no idea," and I didn't, what is just been happening here with Patrick dressing these ladies and them walking out with a black baby doll. So there was something very subversive, as you said, about the whole thing that he was making, but it was done completely with a touch that made it totally unsubversive and acceptable. And it's only if you knew and you scratch a little your head and you winced and you thought, oh, what is happening here? How is that not, that you realized what was happening?
Question has come in about, well, there are two questions I'm going to combine. So a question asks, how can we keep the legacies of people who have died of HIV/AIDS complications? How can we keep their legacies alive? So that's a question for you, and maybe I have a little idea about that as well. And then the other question is that Patrick's HIV diagnosis was not disclosed until after his death. And the questioner is wondering if you could discuss why it was kept quiet. And related to that, Patrick supported HIV/AIDS awareness during his lifetime. And could you tell us about some of the actions that you and Patrick took to support the initiatives? So I'll keep track of the questions. Yes. The first is legacy. How do you, think we could?
Maybe legacy should come last, because it usually does. The interesting thing is that we were for 3 months in New York, I mostly, and Patrick on and off, because he was back and forth with Paris creating the collection, negotiating a contract with, this contract I refer to with Warner Co. That was spring of '87. Warner Co., major apparel corporation, was going to sign Patrick on and for a license for multiple years and invest a very large amount of money in developing the brand. The signature occurred in June, early June, I think, of 87. We flew back to Paris, elated because it was a big deal. And Patrick and I were both tested for HIV because Patrick had little worrying things that we at that time were not thinking of HIV, and so we were tested. And the result came back positive. We were tested in a hospital called Hotel Dieu. And I remember walking on the sunny June day along the Seine. I mean, there's a flower market there on the island. And by it, and we looked at one another and we said, nobody can know of our HIV diagnosis, because at that time, an HIV diagnosis signified death. One didn't know when, but that was what the message was. And we had just signed this big contract, and this corporation would never invest millions of dollars in a business led by a person who just got a death sentence, right? So it was, we kept it completely secret. Nobody was to know, and neither Patrick nor I, to my knowledge, ever spoke with anyone about it. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell who was close friend of Patrick and me. I mean, very embracing of us, and so nobody knew. And that is why it was only revealed after he died. Independent from this diagnosis, we were having a circle, and Patrick more than I, because HIV/AIDS had a kind of head start in New York compared to Europe and Paris specifically, which means that it was much more widespread earlier than a couple of years, 3 years maybe earlier than it came to be widespread in Paris. So Patrick, among his New York friends, some of whom had become also my friends in the meantime, was seeing a lot of people gradually falling sick and dying. Willie Smith died in 88, I believe, but many friends were dying. We did the most active things that we did for AIDS was doing a fundraiser in Atlanta, a fashion show for which Patrick designed a dress specifically, and the whole trunk show that we did there, which was an AIDS fundraiser. But we participated, and Patrick specifically participated in different events that were fundraising for AIDS or for AIDS awareness. And we decided to live through it to the utmost. I mean, as much as we could, functioning with taking care of what we could, but not speaking about it and forging ahead with the business until the spring of 89, where he was beginning to really feel very, he didn't show it, but I could feel that, he was not doing well. We did a fashion show in March of 89. We went on vacation in the late spring. We came back it was mid-August, and he went to hospital and he died 4 months later. So what about the legacy of people who have died of AIDS? I don't think that I'm habilitated to speak to that. I think, Ernest, you are probably better habilitated to speak to that than I. I think that the legacy of a scourge such as AIDS is being dealt with, leaving aside the artifacts and the history of notable person who have died of the disease and whose biography includes it. I think as a whole, we can think about it in the same time. After all, we are just living something that the second big epidemic, right? The COVID. What will be the legacy of COVID? I mean, it's an equal question. So AIDS affected a very specific, at its beginning, let's say during its earlier year, it affected really a very creatively active class of people who happened to be gay.
Very
And
high profile.
And with a very high profile. Visual arts, music, I mean, you name it. Arts were decimated by this.
Do you have any recollection of Rock Hudson coming to Paris to be treated in 85?
You know, I hardly knew who Rock Hudson was.
Yeah, okay. So this is an Americanism, right? For us, when that was one of those moments in mainstream America when I think a lot of people became conscious of HIV in a real way. Another was Magic Johnson, yes, later on being diagnosed.
And he was very brave about it.
Correct. So those are kind of seminal moments that both raised the consciousness of America, but then also were catalysts to push people to go and get tested. Even though in those early days, we didn't have anything related to anything compared to the effective treatments that we have today.
You got tested and you knew that you had it, but there was nothing you could do. So many people thought, why get tested? I'd rather not know.
And I think that that's a thing that is lost on current generations, is that people don't understand that thinking, that there really was nothing to do. And you didn't know what it meant, because unless you already had significant symptoms, you didn't know what the timeline was going to be. The AIDS Memorial Grove in San Francisco is now the repository of the AIDS quilt, which was established by Cleve Jones and is now going to begin to tour again. Does Patrick have a quilt?
Yes.
And so
I think he has a number, actually.
So there's one way that the legacy and memory of people living with HIV who have died is commemorated and remembered. And then obviously shows like this that lift up their artwork and their creative accomplishments. I had a question. I was very curious to know how it is that so many of his garments are in Jackson State University.
Well, I think they have accumulated their own collection. But when I donated, together with my husband now, Bill T. Jones, the collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. For years, when Patrick died, I donated all the archives that were paper and videos to the Schomburg Library for Center, which is the wing, for those who don't know, of the African American Study wing of the New York Public Library.
Correct.
And I looked for a repository of the fashion archive, which Patrick, over his creative years, squirreled always away samples as archive. And I looked for years. I mean, they were in a maid's room that belonged to the apartment, what used to be the maid's room from bygone days, that came together with the apartment we rented in Paris. And then I kept those, and I was looking for a repository that would house the bulk of the collection, because I thought that Patrick's career having been so short, he would probably be forgotten to a large extent. And I wanted, even though now it seems not, and I wanted one place where future researchers could go to, knowing that there was the bulk of the collection for them to look at. And finally, in 2014, if my memory serves me right, the Philadelphia Fine Arts Museum came forward accepting the bulk of the collection. They went through a couple of years of preservation and looking at things and deciding, and it shows the bulk of the collection. There were some things that were duplicates. And those things, there was a request that came from the Jackson Museum. And so I said, why not have something in Mississippi for Patrick? And we sent those things to Jackson.
Oh.
Came to us. So I do not know what part of what they're holding is the things that we donated, and what part is they accumulated. But I do know they did accumulate a thing on their own.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I noted. I noted that, and I thought that was quite special. That both the Philadelphia Museum of Art and Jackson State University had the bulk of the archive, and then all the written documents at Schomburg is perfect because it is our premier archive of African American literatures, and so that's fantastic. Looking for see if there's another question. Another question says, with the advent of PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis, so that's the biomedical prevention that we have now. We have it in a pill a day, and we also have it in an injection that you can have monthly. And so the question is, with the advent of PrEP, some younger generations feel relatively disconnected from AIDS activism of the period that we're talking about in the 80s. And how might we go about bridging the gap to honor those who we lost to AIDS and those currently living with the disease? So it's a good question. You don't want to kind of relive the horrors of a period where the government was unresponsive to the large degree. There was kind of politically sanctioned stigma by the silence of President Reagan during this period, and relatively small amounts of resource from the federal government went into either clinical trial design or services to people living with HIV. So it's a period of great courage, but also lots of very dark stories. And I think that one of the reasons people don't know a lot about it is because people who lived through it are so reluctant to rehash and relive the pain. I'd be curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah, why would one want to relive the pain? I mean, come on. I think it was it was in a way it was our war, and we lost so many people. We were all affected by it, and I think that, like every war, it leaves its mark of trauma, and one is very, very happy if one can turn a page and move on and not revisit it. I mean, my mother survived as a Jewish woman in World War II in France. She worked, she did all kinds of things. And I know that she didn't really speak about it for all those years I was growing up. But when she got much older, she spoke. She wrote, things came out that we had not heard as children or as growing up. So I don't know if there is something in the trajectory of our lives that makes us want to share these things when we feel that we are about to lose contact with it all. But as long as we can live on with fully, I don't think we want to relive those periods of time.
I agree. I think that that's the challenge. I feel obliged in some ways to make sure that people are aware of what occurred so that we don't have to relive those periods by making the same mistakes and not taking lessons learned to heart. So in that way, I feel obliged to share experiences. But I think it's a very good question how the community at large could create mechanisms that were specifically designed to share that history with interested folks today, but in ways that are not shaming or too cautionary tale oriented kind of passing judgment on current practice, but just as information.
Do you think that people ever learn? I mean, look, we have a war in Ukraine now, when people in Europe were saying, oh, we have gone through the wars, World War I, World War II, never again war.
Never again, yeah.
You know?
Well, that's it. That's the cautionary tale I'm talking about, is like, are we destined to live these mistakes over and over again? It's interesting. It's a compelling question that was asked. I thought I would put it out there. It's
no, it's a noble challenge to pick up and to try to make it not happen again, but I don't know.
I wanted to ask you, there's a beautiful intro in the catalog from Andre Leontali, and I was wondering if your time in Paris overlapped
Yes,
when
definitely.
you were living there.
Yes, definitely. I mean, Andre came to all the shows. He was supported. He was miffed somewhat by Patrick's the black memorabilia, the black face. Andre was a child of the South as well, and I think that he was not fully understanding what Patrick was doing. He said to himself, and he expressed his bafflement to us. And then I, in a way, became closer friend of Andre as I was grieving for Patrick. And in the year after he died, he was very supportive and very kind to me. And then when I came to New York to live with Bill T. Jones, and my entire world changed, and I turned a page on a lot of the past life, we kind of lost sight of one another. But Andre was always supportive of Patrick and wanting to help.
Another great migration story from North Carolina to New York to, many years in Paris, and one of our fashion iconic Black American fixtures for many years until his death last year. So yeah, very, very interesting. The last question from the audience is if we have ideas for folks who are interested in participating in HIV advocacy, what are some of them that are available for them? And I would say in the United States, we have a bounty of riches, and sadly, almost all of our major cities have been significantly impacted by HIV, and that means that almost all of them have very robust HIV service and advocacy organizations in them. So, in San Francisco, we're really blessed to have so many, the San Francisco AIDS Foundation being one of the oldest. I think we were established in 1984. And then certainly a whole host of others, including Project Open Hand and others, where people can actually be of service as volunteers to support people living with HIV. But pretty much in each and every city, there are both HIV service organizations as well as HIV volunteer and advocacy efforts underway. And then in Washington, D.C., we have a number of national organizations. One, the National Minority AIDS Council, was established right around this time in 1986. And the AIDS United is another organization that is oriented towards HIV advocacy. So we have a number of ways that people can be involved. And then, of course, the activities in Europe are different because so much of the support for people living with HIV is nationalized in each country. We don't have nationalized medicine. Ours is focused more on state and local approaches. But I think that there's still a great need for advocacy, and there's still a significant number of organizations that are doing it, because while we've made great strides in both treatment and prevention, our ultimate goal is cure. We'd love a HIV vaccine. We'd love a cure for HIV. And so much of our advocacy today is focused in that way. And I think it's important to note that the COVID-19 clinical trial process, the entire process that happened here in the United States through the National Institutes of Health, was actually platformed or put on the foundation of the HIV vaccine clinical trial network. And it was the early work in HIV that formed the foundation of the work that ultimately was done to produce the COVID-19 vaccines. And so, yes, so it's very important for people to understand the added value of HIV treatment, prevention, research over the years, and the residual benefits, all the ancillary benefits that research and those resources provide. So it's been great talking with you, Bjorn, our second time. You are an amazing repository of information. I look forward to spending time picking your brain at some point in the future. And, just thank you very much for being so generous with all of your memories of Patrick and all of the wonderful creations that he had the opportunity to create. And the floor is yours to wrap up for us.
No, I think, thank you, Ernest, for this conversation, and to everyone. The only thing I can say is when Patrick died and I was grieving, I decided I would do everything in my power for his memory to be preserved. And I thank everyone here, the Young Museum, the Philadelphia Museum, and you, Ernest, for giving this platform for the mission to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you.